Hi, everyone. Last week I said on the schedule that I would start a discussion or basically introduce my thoughts on the topic of, the ICR, Institution for Creation Research, and creationism. I got a little distracted, so I appreciate you bearing with me as I wanted to add my voice to what you're already discussing and what you're already reading from the Mitchell book and what you're discussing in your interactive assignment. The idea of the young Earth creationism, it really has an interesting history. And it really started to spring up in the 19th century when early theories about evolution, and they were already afoot, and as you read from your reading, you see that evolution was already starting to grow in popularity. Charles Darwin solidified it, codified it, and really gave a strong voice to it, particularly in biological adaptation. But it was already early on starting to gain traction, even especially in earth sciences, say in geology, looking at uniformitarianism and how long the Earth had been around and how long it took for the Earth for its various processes to unfold. And as a result, the scientific attempts to explain the age of the Earth were starting to conflict with some of the assumptions about what the Bible said about how old the Earth was. Specifically, there was a clergyman in England, James Ussher, who in the 17th century posited a chronology or an age of the Earth based upon looking at probable ages of biblical characters and the genealogies that are offered within the biblical text. And the genealogies are offered in several different places, in Genesis, in later on in Chronicles, and even in the New Testament, there's the genealogies that are stretching from Abraham to the time of Christ and so forth. And doing the math of all those together, he attempted to arrive at a time until sends back to Genesis 1, putting chronology and putting a specific timeline to that. And he arrived at the date of, I think it was like October 23rd, early on, 4004 BC. And that type of number is, you think that's rather specific. I know. But with arriving at that, this idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, that became something that was received assumption, received practice. And it lasted for quite some time, this idea that the Earth is only as old as the Bible has been describing history. So if you literally take the primordial couple in the book of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 3, it'd say the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, and you see those literally as the first people, and then humanity diffuses out from that and expands. That length of the existence of the Earth is going to be seen as congruent or correlative to how long people have been around and how the length of people that the Bible describes have continued from the very beginning. Well, James Ussher, they called the Ussher chronology. And the Ussher chronology is something that really there was no set in stone version. Western Christianity doesn't have a single head that is going to dictate what everyone else must believe. But once something filters into common practice, it pretty much can become assumed by all. And so the Ussher chronology became an assumed number for this 4004 BC. The Earth is 6,000 years old, roughly. And that filtered into various different ways in which people read the Bible. So it didn't take long. By the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, by the turn of the century, it was really much just understood that the Bible teaches, these are air quotes, the Bible teaches that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it teach that. However, what's actually in the Bible and what people assume is in the Bible is a matter of both interpretation and popular teaching. At the popular level, what people teach, either from pulpits, from country churches, and Sunday school programs, what happens in leaflets and what's sold in Christian material stores, this is what contributes to what people believe that the Bible says. And so it became really assumed that the Bible teaches the Earth is 6,000 years old, that it's literal history, and that the implicit use of the Ussher chronology. Well, the Ussher chronology filtered its way into so many different disciplines, even into theological disciplines, that the idea that once, especially in the 19th century, when evolutionary theory started to challenge that, it was seen that now you are somehow going to undercut the credibility of the Bible as a whole. Since the Bible, understand the logic here. In their view, since the Bible teaches the earth is 6,000 years old, and you are teaching that the earth is older than that, then you're undercutting the Bible. And we would say, well, that's several leaps of logic you just took, but that's the view that took place in American fundamentalism, specifically in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So by the time you have the Scopes Monkey trial of with William Jennings Bryant that you watched on YouTube, the science is very much undercutting what is popular assumptions about what the Bible teaches. And it threatens to undercut people's belief in the Bible or its teachings as a whole. So the Ussher chronology is something that must be maintained and must be defended because, for many, that assumption is so embedded into their view that the teachings and the assertions and the spiritual stories and the miracles of the Bible are all tied to the Ussher chronology. Well, enter the Institute for Creation Research, or it's come in a number of different names. There's been Creation Research Institute, the Institute for Creation Research. That early authors related to that were Henry Morris and the Genesis Flood, and John Whitcomb as well. And this happened in the in the 70s and 80s, where you really started to see early scientists break with the mainstream and try to scientifically, using their various disciplines, make attempts to make the Genesis narrative and the creation story seem reasonable within the Ussher chronology. So you see how these are working together. And Ken Ham, now to this day, is still the most prominent figurehead or the most prominent public figure for that young earth creation. Well, that's a very, very distinct and very specific interpretation of the early readings of Genesis. And so because of how the Ussher chronology filtered its way into assumptions about the credibility of the Bible, and also because you've got this evangelical doctrine of what's referred to as inerrancy. Now, what is inerrancy? It's the evangelical or fundamental Christian fundamentalist doctrine that the Bible, in order to be reliable, must be without error or inerrant. So the idea or the doctrine of inerrancy is that the Bible must be inerrant or without error in order to be credible at all. It's a collection of, I always point about, when I'm showing the contents of the Bible, I always point out the diversity of the writings and the various different ways in which it's written, who writes it, and the various different messages it has. Yes, it has continuity and unity in it, but you can't teach the unity, you can't show its unity and fail to show how diverse a collection of works it is, written over such a vast time span. While others will stress the unity to the exclusion of its diversity. So the unity of it, they will say, they will suggest that the Bible is so unified that to suggest any sort of inaccurate or inaccuracy in one area is to undercut claims in all other areas. Well, of course, I disagree with that notion, but that's their claim. Their view is that it must be without error in all, or it is burdened with error. It must be without error in all, or is burdened with error in all. And I say no, based upon the diversity of the collection of writings that it is, there can be one part of it that has no desire to be factually accurate, whereas you have another area that shows great desire to be factually accurate. It's what the author intends at the time. So obviously, I disagree with the Institution for Creation Research, but that's where they're coming from. That is, you must have the doctrine of inerrancy, which is they're coming from the position of belief first. Based upon their view of their doctrine of inerrancy and their inclusion and their assumption of the Ussher chronology, the earth has to be 6,000 years old. It has to be. There's simply no other option. Young earth creationism must be true. Otherwise, in their mind, you take away everything they believe. I obviously disagree with that simplistic view of the complexities of faith, especially the various complexities of the sacred literature all contained within the Bible. But that's the view. So you need to understand this. Now, when you think about creationism, it goes into a number of different facets. There's the most vocal, the most in your face, and the most publicly recognizable is young Earth creationism. That's Ken Ham's, that's Henry Morris, that's the John Whitcombs. Those that are purporting that the literal interpretation of the Bible, particularly of the early chapters of Genesis, which you've read already, and which the inclusion of the Ussher chronology, to assume that the Earth is rather young. It's 6,000 years old. If it's not, then we're in trouble. Well, there's also old Earth creationism. There's the creationists that try to account for the Earth being older than that. They do so through, say, what you'll read in your read in Mitchell about the day-age theory, or what's referred to as the gap theory. The day-age theory being that the various different days of Genesis 1 correspond to the various different geological ages. Well, day-age theory doesn't work because the components of creation that are described in various different days don't correspond to the various different epochs of evolution, evolution periods that have been shown within geologic and biological sciences. Day-age theory doesn't work. Then there's the gap theory. The gap theory is that between Genesis 1:1, chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 1, verse 2, that there's this unspoken gap. In the beginning was the creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God brooded over the waters of the deep. That there's this gap there where supposedly all of geologic and biological history happens, and that could be the several billion years of the Earth's history, and then you have literal history starting with verses 2 and 3. The gap theory really doesn't work because, again, that's trying to impose an artificial trying to shoehorn an artificial compromise into something that doesn't match what we see of the scientific world. So but there still has been some attempts through old Earth creationism to try to still maintain a literal reading of the Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, because you don't want to lose Adam and Eve, and still allow for the Earth to be as old as they say. So that's old Earth creationism. So all that comes into scientific creationism. Those that see creation, they philosophically hold to a creator. They want to philosophically maintain that there is a creator, and they want a science to support what is written in the biblical text. Well, I disagree with those because I think philosophically one can hold to the concept of a creator without requiring a sacred text to be a science text. So I probably would be more in the camp of the old Earth creationism. Not even then. Some would refer to me as, I don't like this label, but some would refer to me as a theistic evolutionist. The idea that the stories of the book of Genesis, while representing and conveying truth, are not themselves designed, from a literary perspective, designed to be taken literally. They are designed to be taken literarily, as literature, with stories and morals and paradigms for understanding the Creator and how one exists within the created world on a moral, psychosocial, spiritual standpoint, without necessarily trying to achieve factual reporting. So and there's a number of different labels people give that. Point is that you encounter creationism, it's basically American Christianity, and there's reasons why creationism really took off in America, why it doesn't in other countries, because people at the popular level have their own Bible to read. They have their own that they can when I say popular, I mean I'm differentiating popular interpretation or popular theology versus scholarly or official theology. So there's official and popular, or maybe even scholarly and popular. And at a popular level in America is a unique country in the sense that people have their own Bible, and what they decide on their own, once they get something in their head, they don't listen to a higher authority telling them otherwise. So we're very independent in that regard. So the reason why young Earth creationism really took off in the U.S. in ways that it couldn't take off in other countries, because we have the sovereignty of the individual. And once individual people across the country had their Bible and they were convinced that the Ussher chronology they had been taught, maybe they've been taught by a country preacher, they've been taught in Sunday school, or maybe they picked up one of the early study Bibles by C.I. Scofield that also had the Ussher chronology within the pages itself, showing Genesis 1:1, this date, 4004 BC. For that reason, people in the U.S. simply just knew at the popular level, if you try to tell me that the Earth is older than 6,000 years, you're taking away my faith. So there's a reason why the conflict between the Bible and modern science occurs in the U.S. unlike any other place on Earth. So that's something to consider as you watch the video and you think about how it is that this supposed conflict is a uniquely American phenomenon. Right? That's my 2 cents. Talk to you soon.